Today, we are going to be responding to this Caelan Conrad video series, which totals, I mean, let me tell you how long it totals. So part 1 is 2 hours and 22 minutes, okay? And part 2, once I've got it up, is going to be 1 hour 52. It's not terrible. And then part 3 is 1 hour and 17. So, okay. Got shorter as it goes along, which is interesting. But basically, I mean, overall, what's that? It's about 5.5 hours, give or take. I will say this, you probably won't be surprised to hear. I'm going to be, 1, try to be quite conservative with what I respond to here in this stream. And then 2, hopefully be even more conservative with what I edit out, or rather, more liberal with what I edit out, more conservative of what I leave in when it comes to, uploading the videos to my main channel. So I don't know, we'll see. I mean, the thing is, there's no way this isn't going to be like insanely long. Like, how can it not? And if it isn't insanely long, then that's just going to be a massive, like, indictment of Caelan Conrad for having made a video so substanceless. Like, if this video is good and has a point, then I should have to spend a long time responding to it. So I'm kind of hoping it doesn't have a point. I do want to say, by the way, on the subject of Caelan Conrad, it's always worth remembering that I've already responded to a Caelan Conrad video. And the video was called TERFs and the Alt-Right. And here's the thing. That video no longer exists. Now, I'm not saying that Caelan Conrad saw my response and realized I'd totally destroyed the video. But that's definitely what happened. And actually, it's kind of funny now, because, of course, if you search for the... Let me just confirm. I mean, I know... So if you search for, say, Caelan Conrad TERF Alt-Right, then whose videos come up? Mine. Which makes sense, of course. But I have thought what you could do if you wanted to be like a memer is you could, if you're talking to a TRA... be like, oh, I love Caelan Conrad. My favorite video by Caelan Conrad is the TERF Alt-Right Connection. Or, TERFs and the Alt-Right is the full name of the video, but I don't know, TERF Alt-Right Connection was a specific bit I responded to, which I thought was especially dumb. But yeah, there you go. So either or, take your pick. Basically, you say that, and then maybe they'll be like, oh, I'll search for this video, and then they search for it. And then Caelan Conrad's video isn't there. All you have is my video debunking Caelan Conrad's video. So, I don't know, Caelan. Shouldn't have done that. My slight concern is that a lot of this video will just be Caelan Conrad, like, for example, maybe posting random clips from Facebook groups, like random posts from Facebook groups. And it will be things that nobody cares about it. I don't know about it. Like basically not actually engaging with any of the gender critical people who are meaningfully engaging in kind of, like proliferating gender critical ideas. And it will just be kind of random stuff. And I'll just be left there going, well, okay, yeah, sure. Somebody might have said that, but so what? Of course, I mean, the obvious point would be, look at all of the things that like AGPs say about women on Reddit. And, obviously not just AGPs, any other kind of trans-identified person. A lot of them will say all sorts of misogynistic stuff, but AGPs especially will, say things like, oh, I was catcalled today and it made me feel valid and all that kind of stuff. It's like, well, that's... So yeah, we'll see.
We know this is what they're saying, and we need the general public to know that too. A bunch of screenshots that look like the Mueller report aren't exactly going to convince anyone of anything. This is the first.
Why is it every single time you guys think you're like exposing the gender critical movement as it really is, it's always actually just obscure people who no one's ever heard of or anything like that? It kind of reminds me of like the whole Lily Cade thing, right? Like Lily Cade says this, admittedly pretty morally objectionable, violent tirade, but who'd heard of Lily Cade? Not me. And then obviously I pointed out, and then they were like, well, the things you say in public are just as bad. And it's like, they don't even seem to realize that, okay, if that's true, then why are you even acting as if you're exposing us? Like, if you think that the things we're saying in public are just as bad, then what's even the point in this post? Like, and that's the thing, it's literally so much kind of goalpost moving. And a lot of equivocation too, because obviously, like, I feel like even like what they'll do is they'll post kind of leaked chat messages from random people to be like, oh, look, this is what they're really saying behind the scenes. And then meanwhile, anybody who actually like is involved in the gender critical movement and speaks to other people knows that actually, no, in private conversations I've had with gender critical people, I've never known any gender critical person to reveal some kind of secret, horrible ill will that they have towards some kind of marginalized group or anything like that. But obviously then they'll be like, well, and then you point out, well, hold on a minute, this isn't actually accurately reflecting the gender critical movement. And then they'll be like, oh, well, that's, what you believe anyway is just as bad. But the point is that their whole argument is to basically say that we're lying and we're like hiding our true intentions, but they can't make that argument credibly when actually, like the reality is that gender critical people are pretty honest about what we believe. Like, that's it. There is this whole idea of like, oh, this is what these people really think is complete nonsense. It's not actually accurate at all. Like, essentially, as far as I can tell, there are people in the gender critical movement who are horrible and abusive and mean, just as there are in any other movement. And those people, as far as I can tell, are mean in private messages and in public messages. Every single time you get these leaked private messages from gender critical people who are, and they're actually objectionable messages, it doesn't take you long to see that they're just as kind of aggressive and incendiary and, kind of morally objectionable publicly as they are privately. And conversely, any other time, when you get the gender critical people who are basically just advocating for gender critical ideas, they say what they believe publicly and they say it privately. So the idea that you can expose the fact that, as if the implication is, well, J.K. Rowling must secretly be behind the scenes talking about how much she hates, whatever, all sorts of marginalized groups. It's just completely made up. And I think it's probably an example of projection. I think that the TRAs in public act nice, act friendly, act like they're not misogynistic, act like they're not hateful. Sometimes. I mean, heck, a lot of the time they don't, but whatever, And then in private, they're worse. And therefore they assume the same is true for gender critical people. Like, because they keep so much stuff hidden, because they keep so much of what they actually believe kind of held close to their chest, they're assuming that gender critical people are too. I think, the kind of projection idea might be accurate, considering it does seem a lot of the time you find out, oh wait, a lot of what these TRAs have said behind the scenes is pretty scary.
And that they do this at the direction of the movement's leaders. The final video...
Okay, I don't know how much of this I'm going to include, but it's worth noting there's the claim that this is being done by the direction of the movement's leaders. Now, I will say this, I don't know who is a leader of the gender critical movement. That's kind of a difficult thing to say, because it's like, who's the most prominent gender critical person? I guess J.K. Rowling. But is she liaising with, is that it? Or would it be kind of, maybe the academic kind of writery people like Helen Joyce or Kathleen Stock? Are they the leaders? Or would it be, perhaps online personalities? I'm not sure. I'd be interested to hear who the leaders of the gender critical movement supposedly are, but I will say for my part that if it's either of those three things, the kind of major celebrity activists for the gender critical side, the kind of academic activists, or indeed the kind of online major personalities, if it's any of those three, that is a problem, but I would be interested to see that case actually being evidenced.
Twitter at Caelan Conrad, and they should be live.
Okay, I want to point this out because it annoys me personally. The audio and the visuals are out of sync. Oh wow, look, oh no, it's the suffragette colours covering the woman's mouth. That's just...
Take, for instance, the phrase traditional family values.
Wait a minute. We're so out of sync, wait.
For instance, the phrase traditional family values.
I'm sorry, but I gotta say this. You can't have such a massive credit sequence showing, like, implying all this effort has been put in, and then have it be that out of sync. I know a lot of people don't watch this, they listen to this, but traditional family values is so out of sync.
Retain their air of harmlessness. Take, for instance, the phrase traditional family values.
It's so out of sync. That's insane.
So I will not be arguing that trans people's identities are valid. I will not be giving them what they want.
Okay, I mean, it's worth noting, just for record, whether trans identity is valid is not the dog whistle. It's literally the only argument. I don't want to say it's the only argument that matters, but to an extent, it is the only argument that matters, because it's like, if biological males can be women, then yeah, they should be included in feminism. Yeah, they should be able to play in women's sports. Yeah, they should be allowed in women's spaces because they would be women, but there's not a good argument for them being women, so there you go. Like, if you're basically at this point saying, essentially, it's just like complete intellectual cowardice being presented as like some kind of principled stand, where it's like, oh, I'm not going to actually engage with the main argument that matters, the only argument that matters, the argument which, if I were able to present a good case for my position, it would completely destroy the gender critical side. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to talk about loads of other stuff, which is just wrong. Like, that's not like avoiding engaging with the dog whistle. That's avoiding engaging with the central point. So it's fine. Like, you don't have to focus on important stuff, but if you're going to choose not to focus on important stuff, don't present it as if like you're actually focusing on what's really important. You're not. You're focusing. It's literally like if I don't know, a Christian started a video like, I'm not going to focus on, does the Christian God exist? Because that's just a dog whistle. No, it's not. It's literally the main argument for why people are likely to disagree with you.
Which is to distract us from the real question, which isn't, are trans people valid, but are gender critical anti-trans activists qualified and unbiased enough to speak on issues of trans rights and identities?
Is that the real question? Really? Because that seems very, very dumb. Essentially what you're saying is, the question isn't, are the arguments good, but are the people making the arguments sufficiently authoritative? And that is so much of a logical fallacy. It's staggering.
A year and a half ago, I did a deep dive into the gender critical subreddit, Gender Critical. I did a video on it, and it was my very first YouTube video, but as of now, I've taken it down.
Oh, because I destroyed it with facts and logic.
So much has changed in the world of anti-trans politics since that video was made, and I no longer feel like it represents me or my views.
Oh, really? You don't feel like it represents you and your views? Why? Because you don't feel that your views are getting destroyed by me and my fantastic debunkings that happen to have come out literally, like, you took that video down within like a week of my response to your video. So I don't know. I mean, I guess maybe you didn't feel like it represented your views, but I don't know. Let's see if this video gets taken down within a week of. I mean, honestly, I am almost at a point where I would think maybe I should save these videos and archive them based on the fact that Caelan Conrad has at least once in the past taken a video down within a week of me having responded to it. And we'll see.
There's nothing of value in that video that won't be covered in more depth here in this series.
You didn't even need to add that last bit, you just said there's nothing of value in the video.
Peaking is analogous to radicalization or red pilling, the process through which someone becomes radicalized into the alt-right.
Well, look, peak is basically just essentially the point at which you realize it's nonsense. Like, essentially all it is a pretty simple term for changing your mind on a topic. The distinct thing about it, I suppose, is the fact that gender identity nonsense is so ubiquitous and so everywhere and so forced upon us to kind of accept it, that therefore there is this idea of that point at which you reach a certain level of nonsense at which you can't tolerate it anymore, and you just realize, oh, this is actually just complete BS. And yeah, that basically had to have happened to pretty much every single gender critical person, because almost every single gender critical person was at some point trans affirming, because that's an idea that's pushed upon us. So yeah, there was a point at which I would have just said, yeah, trans women, all that stuff. And then I hit peak trans when I realized how much nonsense there was.
Of course, most groups are overwhelmingly straight, as is the world, but that doesn't make it any less relevant.
Well, it's also worth noting, in fact, that not only is, so you pointed out that most groups are overwhelmingly straight, but I would say the gender critical movement is disproportionately gay and lesbian. I would be quite confident about, and also disproportionately women. So, and maybe even, I think you could argue, disproportionately non-white.
And this is where our journey begins. Not with a bang, but with a ballad.
A ballad? Oh no. Oh no, is this going to be a song?
Watered down bigots. The ones that get sucked in by memes and confirmation bias and misinformation. You know, like, they don't really care one way or another.
I am realizing there's not going to actually be that much to comment on, because it's basically just like kind of boring speculation about like just the motivations of people. This is basically, ironically, actual fear-mongering to get people into a cult. Basically what this is saying is, oh no, the terrifying transphobes, blah, blah, blah. It's completely exaggerating the risk in order to get people to affirm a claim about reality that is otherwise entirely nonsense, that, you know, trans identities are valid.
I got about the response I expected. A bunch of people called.
Like a lot of, hold on a minute, how is, this is such a massive cell phone. Loads of people commented saying that she was a gross conservative bigot.
Called out my blatant homophobia, quite rightly. Some people agreed that I should be allowed to maintain my homophobia if it's religious, although those comments were fewer and farther between.
So, you're like destroying your own point.
But the general attitude was one of support for my transphobia, regardless of everything else.
So, yeah, but essentially what you're then saying here is exactly what I would agree with. You're getting to the fact that yes, gender critical people think that trans identity is nonsense, and that if a biological male says they're a woman, that's a problem. Yes, that's true. That's what I've always said. That's what the majority of gender critical people I know would happily say and sign off on. And then gender critical people also claim to be progressives who have no problem with homosexuality, no problem with same-sex relationships, no problem with feminism, all that kind of stuff. And you've essentially posted evidence to prove exactly that, that when you presented a bunch of gender critical feminists with a homophobic person, they all said, hey, that's not okay, don't be homophobic. They all rejected it. You're literally, you're contradicted your own point.
There were no repercussions for my homophobia in the groups. There was no ask from group admins to delete or edit out my bigotry. What I did...
Okay, so I guess the problem is, even though you say there are no repercussions, it seemed like people were calling you out. Like, literally, one of the comments I read was somebody saying, what century is this? Like, that's a pretty clear calling out. So essentially, your only objection, I guess, is that, like, you weren't asked to pay some sort of penance.
What I did get was an invite to join another group. This one smaller, more blatant in its ideology and tactics. The kind of gender critical group that you might not like if homophobia bothers you. Like, should...
Okay, so let's just bear this in mind. Okay, let's bear this in mind, though. So now we've got the fact that a smaller, more niche group exists, which expresses views which have already been unambiguously kind of rejected by the majority of gender critical people. But now you have a group which apparently is more tolerant of homophobia, and yet it's only got 127 people. So essentially, you know, this is already pretty meaningless. Because it's just like, okay, yeah, it would make sense that maybe be a small group of people who would, you know, accommodate, I guess, that niche of people who, because like nobody's saying that there is not a single, like, I guess, gender critical person who might have some homophobic ideas.
I noticed a post explaining that this was a brand new group that Darlene herself had created because of me. Well, because of Carol.
I made this group in response to seeing a religious woman get dogpiled in gender-critical women.
So essentially, the entire premise of this group is that there was a gender-critical movement that was a gender-critical group that thought that religious homophobia was totally unconscionable, totally horrible, and then one person specifically, and by the way, okay, notice the implication of this, right? Think about how much of a cell phone this is. It is so rare to have religious homophobes in gender critical spaces that the presence of this one person who wasn't actually a gender critical religious homophobe was enough to motivate an entire group being created. So you think, well, hold a minute, if there were actually a large number of gender-critical religious homophobes, wouldn't this group have already been created? Like, this it's very weird, isn't it? It's like, it's kind of strange, because it's like, if there is actually a large number of gender-critical religious homophobes, then why was it that it was only Caelan Conrad's false presence there under false pretenses that motivated the creation of this group?
For fuck's sake, just let the woman gripe about her son's non-binariness.
They went out of their way.
So essentially, this is giving a woman a space, or saying that women should have a space to complain about the erasure of their rights, even if they have views that other women might find to be objectionable. And that's actually a message of basically intersectionality and inclusion, right? And, I know that there are kind of gender critical people who would say, well, actually, no, if a woman's a kind of traditionalist religious conservative, she shouldn't have a space in women's, kind of in the feminist discourse. But other women might say, well, actually, you know what? Every woman should have a place in feminist discourse. And even if we might disagree with them, they should still have a place to kind of talk about their issues. And that's, I think, also a legitimate stance to take. And that's basically what's being said here, This woman had some concerns that related to her rights as a biological female. And she was being dogpiled for her religious beliefs. And essentially this woman saying, no, actually, we need a space where people can complain about the idea of woman having its meaning take away, and of course the kind of wider negative implications of trans identity for women's rights, while also not having to worry that they'll be dogpiled or, kind of attacked for any other kind of secondary or, tertiary beliefs they might have.
Have you ever had a plan just work?
Well, I can't believe this was your plan, because it's a plan that totally contradicts the main point you're trying to make. Literally, so far, all you have managed to prove here is that, one, a gender-critical movement was a gender-critical group was entirely against your homophobia motivated by religious bigotry, and then, literally, entirely for you, because apparently your presence there was so unique that no one had ever seen anything like it before, one woman decided to set up a group to accommodate you because she thought that women who have legitimate concerns about their sex-based rights shouldn't be shut down and attacked for other beliefs they might have. This does not prove some kind of nonsense idea that, I guess, the gender-critical movement is naturally conservative or homophobic or anything like that. No, you're very far off proving that point. Indeed, you've actually actively contradicted it.
I was just so glad that I didn't have to say anything extremely ugly to get into the inner circle. And once I was in...
Wait, hold on. What do you mean the inner circle? Oh my god. No, you... The inner circle is some random Facebook group with 127 members that was created specifically for you by your own admission. That's the inner circle? You think that's... Oh wow, guys, turns out none of us, all the people who are kind of actively advocating for the gender critical movement, doing all of this kind of work to get involved, spread gender critical ideas, talking to, hanging out with, having, DMs with other gender critical content creators. No, we're not part of the inner circle, because we're not part of this random Facebook group with only 127 members that was created solely for the purpose of accommodating somebody who isn't even gender critical. Apparently that's the inner circle. Oh dear.
It took less than a day to realize.
Oh wow, that's a really good point from Lola. He doesn't realize we often have fake names because we get death threats from his ilk. Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. Yeah, you're right. He infiltrated GC headquarters. Oh my god, yeah, that's it. I was hoping that the stronghold of some random Facebook group would never get infiltrated. But somehow it happened. And you would think, we had such a great strategy of keeping people out by literally making it a group that would just try to accept anybody they could.
I even found a gender-critical anti-vaxxers group, so, intersection...
I mean, it should also be pointed out that Facebook is peak boomer, right? So I'm not really, it's not surprising that they would skew conservative on Facebook, because it's a boomer site, right? And boomers generally skew conservative.
Complete with conspiracy theories that span the globe, like that there is a plot to destroy society through LGBTQ+ acceptance, some going as far as to believe that the end result of trans people existing is to make it so that humanity becomes another species altogether.
Half human.
Oh, like the transhumanism thing. Yeah, that's the thing. It's a very boring take, because essentially you're saying, well, I went on this fringe, by the way, not the inner core, like you said. It's the opposite to the inner core. You went on this fringe Facebook group and found some quite fringe beliefs. So what, right? Like, what does this have to do with, like, J.K. Rowling or Graham Linehan or, you know, whoever else? I mean, I kind of would think also Meghan Murphy, but, you know, again, I'm not sure, because I don't really know that much about Meghan Murphy, because, you know, I don't really see much from her. But yeah, I mean, like, the trans, like, I've heard, like, people bring up the transhumanism thing. And it's like, okay, that is a thing, but it's definitely a fringe belief. Like, I'm aware of it. And, like, I never thought to myself, oh, God, one person said something which sounds kind of like, you know, because for me, I mean, I know there's probably been people who, like I know that there have been people who've commented on my videos, like, talking about the whole transhumanism thing. So maybe they're here right now. I'll say, personally, I think the whole transhumanism, like, conspiracy thing is quite unbelievable. I've never sat there and been like, oh God, what have I done? I've become part of such a crazy movement, because, like, the majority of people don't seem to believe in that. And by the way, even if they did, so what? Like, at the end of the day, that doesn't make the gender critical beliefs wrong. It's like, the best case scenario here, I guess, is that gender critical is like a correct belief that also happens to be believed by some people who believe in some crazy stuff as well. But so what?
And that these claims were being made publicly and went largely unchallenged internally.
Well, so, like, Jennifer Bilek is the only person who says this, right? And yeah, like, obviously you're going to have some people who say it, but it's not like a core part of gender critical ideas. Yeah, like, nobody who's ever kind of defined gender critical has been like, oh yeah, and also there's belief that they're trying to turn people into robots. There have been, like, some people. Like, Jennifer Bilek is, as far as I know, the only person who's mentioned it.
As long as what they were reading confirmed their beliefs, it went undisputed nearly 100% of the time.
Like, the TRAs are the real ones who love to just love and kind of just applaud the most nonsense claims. I mean, how many times people say, oh, science affirms trans identity, proves trans people are valid. And it's like, that's of course, and then, like, how many of those people actually know what they even mean when they say that? None of them. Like, they'll post some, like, the Scientific American article, which I don't know, like, is that even, like, one of them? I mean, the funniest one is the one where, like, some, like, it's like puts DSDs on a spectrum, and then even the person who wrote the article clarified that they weren't meaning to say that sex is a spectrum. It was just like a graphical thing they were doing. I can't remember what it is, but yeah, there's definitely an article out there, which lots of TRAs share, where even the author of the article has come out and said, hey, I wasn't saying that sex is a spectrum. Sex is a binary. I was just doing it as like an illustration of, like, kind of varieties within the binary. You know, I wasn't presenting it as a spectrum. It's something like that. I can't think who it is, but literally, like, that's the thing. That's how deep the wrongness of trans identity goes, where they even have, like, the authors of articles they're sourcing saying it's wrong. Where you even have, I mean, my favorite example is Riley Grace Rochon, who is supposed to be, like, a kind of somebody who, like, does a lot of research, is, you know, kind of like a streamer who, like, you know, has a whole, you know, one of those little research documents lots of streamers like to have. And yet Riley was reading a kind of Scientific American article about, like, the sex spectrum, and literally very conspicuously misinterpreted the information. It's something I cover in one of my videos. It's also something Rubble of Empire has covered too. Like, even the people who present themselves like the researchers consistently totally misunderstand just the basic information that they're even presenting to enforce their arguments. And yet these people always get likes from, you know, all of the fans, because of course, even though what they're saying is complete nonsense, it's affirming their belief. It's saying that trans identity is valid. And yeah, I've seen, like, TRAs say, like, even contradictory things, but as long as they affirm trans identity, it's fine.
It's difficult to reason people out of positions they didn't reason themselves into.
Gender critical people don't reason themselves. I'm sorry. Like, that's just the lack of self-awareness, goodness me.
These weren't like the other groups, which functioned almost entirely as a hatred circle jerk between regular members. In the parent groups, there were too many new people, too many outsiders coming through. Which makes sense. After all, not every child that...
But this is so contradictory, because if the point's supposed to be like, well, the new people, but then according to you, literally, like, you immediately made one post and were, like, immediately accepted into one of these groups. So if these groups are supposed to be some big secret, well, it's not a very well-kept secret, is it? It's just so much... This story just is very... There's a lot of holes in this story.
One of the staples of a cult movement is recruitment, like Scientology's free personality test. They gotta get you in the door. Just step right in and we'll tell you everything you need to know.
I'm sorry, can I just point this out? Like, basically, it's saying, like, one of the functions, or like one of the staples of a movement is trying to get people to join that movement. And it's like, the problem is, this is a bad definition of a cult, right? Like, you're saying this, it's like very dumb, because you're like, oh, Scientology tries to get you to be a Scientologist, which, you know what else tries to get you to agree with them? The gender critical people. And it's like, yeah, but the TRAs try to get people to agree with them too. Admittedly, they tend to do it through much more coercive means. They don't actually try and like change your mind with logic or arguments. They usually just attack you and call you a bigot and make you feel like a horrible person if you disagree with them. Maybe that's a little bit more cultish. But the point is, every movement, like pretty much every political ideology, a lot of religions, and, you know, maybe some, neckbeard's going to say that, well, religions are cults too. But, like, the point is, whatever it is, I mean, even, like, philosophies, like, you know, I mean, philosophies of life, philosophies of ethics, there's so many things where, yes, people are going to want to change other people's minds.
Like that you have some terrible personality flaws that only we know how to fix in just 2 short, 8 hours.
Oh, it sounds like a terrible personality flaws. You mean like being transphobic? It's just fun. It's just fun that it's like so... The lack of self-awareness. Like, oh, what if I told you there was a movement that tried to convince you to follow them by pointing out your personality flaws? Okay, yeah, I can believe there's a movement like that out there. They've been doing, you know, attacking J.K. Rowling a lot too.
I assume you have a credit card on you? This cult...
Sorry, I was picking something out of my teeth. But, like, that's really dumb, because now you're bringing up the fact of, like, cults being economically exploitative. But is the gender critical movement, like, do they exploit people? I'm not even aware of, like, any instance of, like, the gender critical movement being, you know, massively money motivated at all. It's just, yeah, like, that's, like, you've now contradicted. There's so much, like, Caelan contradicts the central point of this video a lot. Like, there have been several moments where, like, just key points that are trying to be made have been contradicted. Now you have it, like, one of the things brought up to imply, like, oh, this is a cult, is asking for people's money. And it's like, well, the gender critical movement doesn't do that. The gender critical movement is never like, oh, I assume you've got your credit card.
Master will come openly in a flying saucer, and the whole world will know of his coming.
She said flying saucer with a straight face. It's pretty much common knowledge at this point that most cults believe some wacky ass shit like that. What is not common knowledge is that cults are often heavily laden with bigoted...
I mean, again, so it should be pointed out, you're getting, again, the kind of contradiction of, like, well, something that makes something a cult is a belief in wacky, absurd claims. And it's like, well, what makes somebody gender critical? Oh, the belief that biological sex should be the primary and exclusive reference for whether somebody's a man or woman, that it makes sense to understand women, and by extension feminism and patriarchy and misogyny, with reference to the reality of biological sex. Like, that's the issue. There is no, like, wacky claim here.
And the erasure of whiteness itself as a motivation. He was very race critical.
Whoa, the race critical thing. That makes no sense, because gender critical means you're critical of the idea of gender, and that gender should influence, like, much about our life, that we shouldn't define people by gender. That's what gender critical means. Conversely, being a white supremacist is literally the opposite to being race critical. I've made a whole video about this before where I point out, like, to what where I basically compare race realist to gender critical, because loads of people will, like, act as if they're the same thing, or, like, act as if they're comparable. They'll be like, whoa, calling yourself gender critical is just like calling yourself race realist. And I, you know, pointed out, which I shouldn't need to, but I did because I like proving points, even when it should be obvious. You know, like already the thing's wrong, I still like debunking them. They are obviously they're not comparable at all. In fact, in many ways, they are literally diametrically opposed.
Social media, however, has given the layperson with an internet connection previously impossible access.
Hold on a minute. This is like implying, like that seems to just imply that before the internet, you couldn't have really large, expansive cults. And that's not true at all. Like there were loads of cults that precede the internet, which spread incredibly far. So yeah, just wrong.
What matters is their ability to connect, reinforce each other's beliefs, and police each other, and most importantly, to recruit.
I feel like it's just like such an obvious thing that you would want to do if you're going to make a video about like something being a cult, is make it very clear what exactly makes something a cult in contrast to basically any other movement. Because you either have to, so if you cast an incredibly broad net with your definition of cult, you kind of have to accept the fact you're basically saying anything's a cult, and therefore the accusation of being a cult is meaningless. And conversely, if you want to say, actually, no, not everything's a cult, there are very select few things which are cults, then you would need to explain, like I say, what it is that makes something a cult. Because there you just had like, oh, these people would, they reinforce each other's beliefs. And it's like, okay, well, that happens in loads of movements. Of course, yes, again, I should point out that TRAs definitely reinforce each other's beliefs. They undeniably reinforce each other's beliefs. And I would not consider that in and of itself cult-like. Of course they're going to reinforce each other's beliefs. They all agree on the same thing. Why wouldn't they talk about it? The way that, again, I believe we should overcome that is to simply present better arguments kind of in opposition to them.
Through painting trans adult as disgusting and violent predators and stigmatizing trans youth as coerced and their trans identities as a mental illness. Both recruitment techniques are intended to elicit intense emotional reactions in the recruit, namely ones of fear and disgust.
But yeah, like the whole thing about, oh, they're doing all of this fear tactics and all of that, that's like specifically for these Facebook groups. And again, like the problem here is you'd have to be arguing the gender critical movement is represented by these very specific Facebook groups, which of course isn't true. I mean, the reality is, and essentially it seems to be the focus pretty much is entirely on how the gender critical, or how this particular facet of the gender critical movement recruits, if you like, if you want to use that language, appeals to boomer parents. And yeah, sure, it might do that in a particular way, but that's really a quite small part of the gender critical movement, as far as I know it. The real question is, well, how does a gender critical movement recruit, for example, and again, recruit, I know some people might not like language, appeals to whatever else, radical feminists, lesbians, and then of course you have, I mean, how does it appeal to gay men? I mean, and obviously again, quite young people. The thing is, again, like saying, well, this is one particular way, this is how boomer parents get involved in the gender critical movement. Assuming even that that's true, that is one facet of the gender critical, like, kind of people who are gender critical. And even then, that might well say more just about the attitudes of the parents than the kind of modus operandi of the gender critical movement. And of course, on top of that, most of like the gender critical movement that we're seeing, like actually being expressed and advocated for, is not being advocated for by random parents. Like, I mean, I think, for example, you could say that, I mean, and also you think about, for example, like J.K. Rowling, she is a parent, I think. I think I'm right in saying, I assume she has kids. I don't actually know for certain that she does, but I assume she does. And yet, obviously, she didn't become gender critical because of some random Facebook group. She became gender critical because she started a conversation with Magdalene Burns, like by J.K. Rowling's own kind of, testimony. She spoke to Magdalene Burns because she was like interested in understanding gender critical ideas. And who was Magdalene Burns? A left-wing socialist, lesbian, radical feminist activist. So if you want to talk about the real people kind of representing the gender critical movement, even in the case of somebody who is a boomer parent, J.K. Rowling, when you say, well, how did she get involved in the movement? It ultimately comes back down to young, left-wing, politically active, radical feminists and lesbians. So then you have to say, well, how are those people getting recruited? And shockingly, I don't think it's by Facebook groups of parents.
And for a decent amount of gender-critical people, they really just don't even understand what trans people are arguing for, because they get their information filtered through people who obfuscate and outright lie to them.
Okay, yeah, so there we go. Apparently, gender-critical people don't understand what trans people are advocating for. And of course, again, literally, it is, a lot of the time, is a case of you can just take what they say and reverse it. So, like, in that, you got the claim, like, well, the gender-critical people, you know, what makes them gender-critical is that they don't understand what trans people are arguing for. Bear in mind, okay, like, here's the thing. There are people who will not like my response videos and say that, you know, they're disorganized, maybe a bit too rambly, maybe I could be a bit more to the point. But the one thing you can't deny is that I sit here and I watch these videos all the way through and I listen to and engage with every substantial point and then some that these people make. So that's, you know, pretty, you know, so obviously, at least in my case, I can definitely say that I'm hearing what they're saying, I'm hearing what they're arguing for, and that is the basis for my gender critical position. So it's already nonsense. But of course, the reality is that it's indeed the people who are not gender critical who generally don't understand what trans-identified people are arguing for and what TRAs are arguing for. It's actually like what we want to do. This is why the gender critical movement is constantly wanting the kind of TRAs who are representative of the trans movement to be given platforms. That's why the gender critical movement really wants Judith Butler to be saying all of the nonsense she's saying. Like, here's the thing, genuinely, if, like, let's say there was going to be a massive kind of mainstream publicized debate between a gender critical person and a TRA, I would be just as excited that, so obviously I would be excited that a gender critical person is going to be allowed to come out and make the gender critical case in explicit terms for everyone to hear. But I would be just as excited to hear a TRA come out, like a TRA, like, you know, like a Grace Lavery or a what, like Joss Pryor, I think is that, like these kind of like insane people on Twitter, India Willoughby, to come out, I mean Judith Butler, to come out and say what they think. Like, I would be just as excited for the public to be confronted. And to be honest, I think the TRAs might be smarter than that. I mean, well, we know they are, because that's why they refuse to debate. Because not only do they not want people to know what gender critical people believe, they don't actually want to be in a situation where what they believe is kind of really put out there and projected. So yes, I think it's pretty obvious to me that the gender critical movement most definitely does understand what TRAs are arguing for, 100%. And it's actually the only way that the TRAs are able to kind of be around and a relevant force at all is because there are far too few people who do know, you know, who are not gender critical and don't know what it is that the TRAs are standing for.
And it is the people who profit from this ideology who sit at the top of the cult's hierarchy, as they have the most power in reshaping reality and disseminating talking points.
That doesn't make any sense. Okay, first of all, again, like, I think I already said at the beginning that Caelan is going to have to be specific about what is meant by being at the top of the hierarchy. Because, again, I kind of already said, what does that mean? Does it mean, like, the people who are kind of, if you like, the intellectual kind of theorists, the academic people, the people who maybe are kind of grassroots organizers? Does it mean, for example, Posey Parker? Does it mean, or does it mean, like, the most kind of prominent, well-known mainstream people talking about this, in which case it would obviously be J.K. Rowling? Like, that's the thing. You would have to argue, like, you have to say who it is that you're talking about when you're talking about people at the top, and I'm hoping that's going to be explained at some point. But then, of course, you get the claim, well, they're the people profiting from this. And then I'm like, well, what is that then? Like, I don't know who it is who's supposed to be profiting from this.
All you have to do is hashtag stand with them, vote for them, go to their seminars, buy their books, follow them on Twitter.
See, the use of hashtag stand with them seems to suggest, because of course the hashtag stand with is pretty much, well, not entirely, but nowadays it's most often used for hashtag I stand with J.K. Rowling. So again, is the implication here that J.K. Rowling is cynically exploiting the gender critical movement for profit? Because that's literally not true. As far as I know, first of all, J.K. Rowling has not written a book about the gender critical movement. J.K. Rowling is not like doing speeches about the gender critical movement. J.K. Rowling is not profiting from being from being gender critical at all. And indeed, one might argue, if anything, that it has actually hurt her financially. Now, obviously, I think people are, like some people might not want to admit that J.K. Rowling has been hurt financially because they might perceive that to be a potential victory for the TRAs. But to me, it seems quite likely that there are going to be more people who have decided to cancel J.K. Rowling, to not have anything to do with her, to not want to engage with her kind of, intellectual property because they disagree with her, than people who have changed their mind. Like, that's the thing. It just doesn't work at all. And the thing is, I mean, you could if you wanted to. Like, there are people who will say that I'm a grifter, and at least there's like more logic there, because I'm somebody who would be nobody if I didn't speak about this topic. Having said that, I like to think that if I spoke about a different topic, I could have been similarly successful. But as far as we know, we could say, well, you were just nobody, whatever, a relatively small YouTuber, then you started talking about this topic. You can argue that, but then the problem is I'm not like a leader in this movement. So that's kind of the issue. The people who are high up are the people who aren't really getting that much out of the movement, and the people who are low down are the people who are kind of getting stuff out of it, which is kind of the opposite to how a cult should work. Like, I'm not high up on the hierarchy, and yet, I'm getting something out of, obviously it's just a little bit on Patreon.
That means you have to concede that on some level, the people at the bottom of it are being manipulated and controlled.
But again, who's at the bottom of this? That's what I'm confused about. I don't know, like, who is it? Because it kind of seems to me like the gender critical movement is really non-hierarchical, right? Because the thing is, there's like, and that's kind of why I'm confused about this whole idea of there being people at the top, because it kind of seems like you could almost argue, depending on your perspective, that any individual is at the top. That's a good point. Someone says the people at the bottom are voiceless women in prison. We're advocating for those women. Yeah, like that's the thing. The gender critical movement is advocating for the people at the bottom, which is why, again, like it's really difficult. I mean, again, I say that, but obviously at the same time, it's difficult to even think of it as like a hierarchical movement, because it is like, yeah, you'd say those are the people at the bottom, but then having said that, those people are also platformed. Those people are given like an opportunity to express their ideas and things like that. Like, it's very egalitarian, and it's very non-hierarchical. And basically anybody can, if they are, I guess, brave enough, and if they have, I guess, the resources and the inclination, and I say the resources, I literally mean like an internet connection, a microphone, and a camera, can pretty much start doing this and really get somewhere. Hello everybody, so I realized that I forgot to record an outro to this video, and therefore I'm just going to say, obviously, this is the end of part 1. The series is 5.5 hours. I don't think anybody can think that, can be mad at me for taking more than one part for this. We'll see. I mean, thus far, I think we're making a relatively good pace. I think we're almost keeping pace with the runtime of the original video, because there are large portions of time where I'm not necessarily saying nothing, but I'm saying stuff that doesn't get included in these edited down clips, which I'm uploading, of course. And on that note, if you do want to kind of see more stuff, or just, interact with me, see me off for some, I don't know, just kind of more casual comments, then of course you can always check out the live streams. But nowadays, since I'm doing the live streams on my channel and you get notifications for them, I don't feel the need to bring that up as much. But yeah, if you haven't checked them out before, I should probably move this closer to me. If you haven't checked that out before, then by all means do. Yeah, obviously so far the video has not been very good. I've already recorded quite a bit of footage that will be in part 2, so I can confirm it doesn't get much better in part 2. However, the important thing is that we're making it through. And ultimately, I mean, I don't know if it's going to achieve anything. I don't know how many people who have kind of bought into the TRA nonsense are going to actually engage with my responses in good faith. I think it's probably going to be very few, but even if it's just 1 or 2, that will be, I've done my part. But yeah, so with that said, I mean, of course, if you want to share this video, like it, help out when it comes to things to do with the algorithm, that's great. If you haven't subscribed yet, of course you should. And if you want to comment below, let me know what you think. That would be awesome as well. And yeah, apart from that, oh, you can give on Patreon. You can give on PayPal. At some point, I do need to set up super chats and all that kind of stuff, but I haven't yet. So there you go. Oh, and of course, the Amazon books thing. I've already got a few books which people have sent, and I'm going to open those on my birthday. You know, so it's like a proper like birthday present thing, because I think that's a fun, cute little thing to do. So, you know, you're not going to get a chance to do this again until next year. So if you've been thinking, oh, you know, I want to buy a book, I want to be part of this fun little birthday celebration thing, well, you know, do it quick before the opportunity passes you by. So apart from all that, I'll just say thank you to my current patrons.